This is Mike Wallace in New York. In our studios in Chicago is Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King, I understand that you have just reached agreement with Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago. Does that mean that the threat of violence tonight in Chicago is considerably diminished in your estimation?
Well, I certainly hope so, and in a sense I feel that the threat of violence tonight is diminished a great deal as a result of the agreement. I don't want to give the impression that the agreement reached this afternoon will in any way solve the ultimate problems which we face in Chicago, but I do think they will do a great deal to ease tensions tonight.
We'll have an opportunity to talk to you at some length later in this broadcast, Dr. King. First, for an on-the-spot report direct from a National Guard command post in Chicago, CBS News correspondent Bill Plant.
This is Bill Plant at the Northwest Armory in Chicago. Despite that agreement between Mayor Daley and Dr. Martin Luther King, 3,000 Illinois National Guard troops are deployed tonight in a 4-square-mile area of Chicago's near southwest side, where shooting and vandalism and rioting have occurred for the past 3 nights. The troops are commanded by Major General Francis Kane, commander of the Guard. This is his command post. Thus far, this evening has been relatively quiet. A situation map pinpoints the trouble spots of previous nights. Additional troops are standing by, ready to serve as security guards in the event that prisoners are taken tonight. Chicago Police Superintendent Orlando Wilson said today that he had advised the mayor to call out the Illinois National Guard because he felt that the situation here was beyond the capacity of civil authority. The guardsmen are armed with pistols, rifles, grenades, machine guns, bayonets, and they will use tear gas, their commander says, if it is necessary. They are now patrolling the area. 2 persons are dead in the wake of the rioting. There is heavy property damage. There was much looting and vandalism. It all began with a minor incident, and it grew steadily worse. This is the story of the Chicago riots.
CBS News presents a special report. The Chicago Riots. Here is CBS News correspondent Mike Wallace.
Chicago is the second city of this nation. Tonight, it is the nation's #1 battleground, embroiled in racial crisis. It is a proud and prosperous city, home of the meat packer, the nation's rail hub, merchant to the Middle West. Luxury skyscrapers attest to its affluence. Yacht clubs dot its lake shores. Gracious suburbs lie around its central core. But in that central core are the Negro ghettos, where the turmoil of the last 3 nights was spawned. Almost 1 of every 3 persons in Chicago's 3.5 million is a Negro. Citywide, unemployment among those Negroes is 3 times that of whites. And among teenagers, the disparity is even greater. 8 out of 10 Negro children go to segregated schools. The annual income of the average Negro family in Chicago is 40% lower than the average white families. Into that environment last Sunday came Dr. Martin Luther King, moving the Negro Revolution from south to north. Last Sunday, Dr. King addressed a civil rights rally, an anti-poverty rally at Chicago's Soldier Field. He outlined 35 demands for equal rights, and he insisted that nonviolence was the only way to achieve them. After speaking, Dr. King led his followers on a 3-mile march to City Hall to post a list of those demands to make Chicago, in his words, a free and open city. Those demands, among other things, called for open housing, more Negro employment, and negotiations by the city with so-called welfare unions organized by the civil rights movement. And then at City Hall, as King used adhesive tape to post the demands, the marchers crowded round him. King took the dramatic action just a day before meeting with Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley on the problems of the Chicago Negro. Afterwards, they held separate news conferences and expressed sharply differing points of view.
They have to be resolved. They can't just be resolved overnight. No reasonable person thinks they can, and no reasonable person expects they can. But I know if people sit down and exchange what thoughts they are, and also with the problem, give some of the ways and means of solving the problem. It's easy to keep saying, certainly we have slums. You have slums in Atlanta, you have slums in New York, you have slums in every city of the United States, and the people of Chicago certainly are not proud of the slums. I'm not proud of the slums. I would hope that tomorrow every slum building in Chicago would be demolished, and we'd have a decent home and a decent apartment for every family. This is the aim of this present administration, and this is our program, and this is our objective, and we're going to go through with it, and we're trying to go through with it.
The mayor said to us that things were already going on, that they were seeking to do certain things on the question of slums and on the various problems that we face in housing. Our contention was that while things were being done, they were merely bringing about surface changes, and that the problem is so gigantic in extent that it demanded structural changes. It demanded an imaginative, bold program, because the Negro community can no longer live with token changes.
Dr. King and Mayor Daley achieved no meeting of the minds. Critics of both said that neither man was really listening to the other. Dr. King talked later of the methods the Negro community would use to secure what he called a free and open Chicago. He spoke of using the Negro vote, of boycotts, of sit-ins and picketing. And then, on the west side of Chicago, in 96-degree temperatures at 5 o'clock last Tuesday afternoon, some Negro children at the corner of Roosevelt Road and Throop Street opened a fire hydrant. Here was the shabby intersection where it all began. Chicago's slum kids wanted some relief from the heat, so the residents did what residents of city slums do everywhere. They turned on a hydrant. But the police came and turned it off. They said they had to preserve the water pressure in case of fire. The Negro residents were not impressed. They turned another hydrant on. As fast as police went around turning hydrants off, the Negroes opened others. And they protested that once again the police were singling them out. The Negroes said the hydrants were being allowed to run open just a short distance away, where Italian Americans lived. The youngsters made the most of it as the street was turned into a kind of wading pool. These are young people who must find most of their pleasures in the street. Many of them are school dropouts. The juvenile delinquency rates in Chicago are highest in this area. 28 of every 100 children here are classified delinquent. When the police turned off the hydrants once again, this playful spirit that you see evaporated quickly. Rocks were thrown at police, and then the real trouble began. There was a chase down the street, and then arrests followed. This was just the beginning of a night of trouble and vandalism in which 24 people were to be picked up by the police. This episode of heat, water, and sudden temper was the start of an evening in which store windows in the neighborhood were broken and stores were looted, but the incidents were still relatively minor. The next morning, Mayor Daley held a news conference at which religious leaders were present, including Roman Catholic Archbishop John Cody. They spoke of the disturbances the night before, and both men portrayed the street episodes in very mild terms.
I think that we do not need to be too concerned about these occasional things, although they're certainly giving a bad image to our city.
I would hope and pray that we would have the understanding that we're trying to bring to every section of our city. I don't think it was a riot. I think that it was, as other cities would describe such an event, a juvenile incident.
But later that day, police again closed an open water hydrant, and this time the response in the Negro neighborhood was furious. There was more vandalism, there was looting, and crowds of Negroes surged into the streets. They were angry and they were bent on destruction. 400 policemen moved into the area. They threatened to arrest anyone who didn't go home and stay there, and they made good their warning. A number of policemen were injured by flying bricks and rocks and bottles. The night brought intensified violence. Molotov cocktails were hurled into buildings and numerous fires were set. Firemen were stoned when they tried to put out the fires. In one block alone, 4 fires were burning at the same time. While buildings were gutted, dozens of stores were being looted. As police marched through the streets, there was firing by snipers. Police fired back, and 2 residents were hit and wounded by stray bullets. Police arrested 20 Negro youths and seized dozens of others who were later released. And scores of people were injured in this second night of combat between Negroes and police. By Thursday, as local church leaders gathered at the Shiloh Baptist Church to see what they could do to help ease the situation, it was obvious that something more than juvenile incidents were involved. But Dr. King maintained that his nonviolent movement was not to blame.
We are trying to conduct a nonviolent movement here in Chicago, and we're going on with that program, but we need support. And there's no point in the power structure and anybody else saying that because we are peacefully going around trying to change conditions that we are the cause of the riots. That's dishonest. It is untrue. It is unfair to say it to the public, because we have stood up for nonviolence with all of our hearts. And those who will make this peaceful revolution impossible will make a violent revolution inevitable. And we've got to get this over. I need help. I need some victories. I need some concessions to take back.
Chester Robinson, who formed the West Side organization, said the violence could be held down if the clergymen would help get the young people back inside their homes.
This is why we have to get out into the streets. Not in a march, not as a protest, but as men and women who are trying to solve problems. And if we can talk to some of these mothers, we can talk to some of these kids, talk to some of these teenagers, we can get them inside. But if we don't, there's going to be more burning, there's going to be more police brutality, and tonight there might be some shooting on the part of the community people.
And there was, in the most violent night of the week. CBS News correspondent John Lawrence reports.
George, stay down. There might be something killing over here. Stop going first. Hey, Sergeant, where's
I don't know. They may be our men.
There was as much gunfire on the corner of Wood and Lake last night as a Vietnam battlefield.
Out of here. Take a right turn.
100 police shot it out with snipers in an all-Negro apartment project. The snipers fired from windows. The police blasted back from behind parked cars.
I can't tell from that. On the second window down, on the left. Yeah. That's the son of a... Right up there.
Despite all the gunfire at Wood and Lake, not one person was wounded in the crowded buildings, and no police were hit. The snipers escaped in the maze of stairways and apartments. The bloodshed began later, a few miles away. This is Roosevelt Road, running through the heart of the Negro West Side, scene of most of the looting and shooting. It is a slum boulevard of white store owners and Negro customers, where the white man is not welcome after dark. Almost every store window was smashed for blocks. Almost everything was stolen or destroyed, and about a dozen shops were set ablaze. None of the fires along Roosevelt Road appeared to be serious, and few people were hurt. The biggest blow was to the store owners, who lost tens of thousands of dollars in goods. A Molotov cocktail, a bottle, gasoline, and a rag for a wick makes an effective homemade firebomb. Many Molotov cocktails were thrown in the streets. A boy was seized as a suspect in the shooting of a policeman in a narrow alley off Roosevelt Road. The policeman, shot in the back while chasing a looter, survived his wound. The wounded patrolman was rushed to a hospital, where he's recovering today. One of the suspects, deathly afraid, pleaded with the police not to shoot him. A shot rang out, and the police ducked for cover.
Put that light out. Put the light out. Let's see if we get him in a spot. Get up here. Get that kid. Get up. Get up. Get up.
This young man, who was from Mississippi, was one of 2 Negroes shot and killed last night. Police say he was looting a store on Roosevelt Road, chased down the same alley where the policeman was wounded, and shot. Many were shot in the series of sporadic shootings between police and Negroes. Hundreds were arrested. After dawn, the prisoners were taken to criminal court for the massive task of booking them. They were charged with everything from disorderly conduct to treason. Treason in the case of 13 persons caught in an apartment. Police say they were talking about narcotics and planning widespread demolition and murder. There were reports that militant revolutionary groups were taking part in the rioting, especially the shooting at police. During the day, it was relatively quiet on the west side. There was scattered looting, but no serious outbreaks until mid-afternoon. A huge fire broke out in the riot area. A bottling company plant burst into flames and burned to the ground, and apparently it was set by arsonists. A co-owner of the company told CBS News correspondent Bruce Morton that he had been threatened, that he was warned as late as this morning when he was told his block-long building would be burned. And it was burned. When that wall collapsed, people were evacuated from their homes in the area. But apparently, despite all the flames along that block, no one was hurt. One Negro employee said all the Negroes in the buildings had been warned today to get out, for the building would be burned down. Then Illinois Governor Otto Kerner mobilized the National Guard. 3,000 men from the 33rd Infantry Division were called to their armories, dressed in battle fatigues and armed.
Just takes a second to slip it on.
Tear gas, but just as a secondary precautionary measure. The division has just returned from 2 weeks of summer training, and its commanding general says his men are well prepared for riot control. But the guardsmen, who are civilians, seem upset, not welcoming the task of keeping order, possibly shooting at people in their hometown. John Lawrence, CBS News, Chicago.
In the last 3 nights, then, in Chicago, there have been more than 300 arrests in the riot areas, dozens injured, 2 deaths. At this moment, 900 police are scattered through the Negro ghettos, guarding against another violent night. As John Lawrence said, Governor Otto Kerner has ordered out 3,000 men of the Illinois National Guard. They're at the ready. And the citizens of Chicago wait anxiously and hopefully for a peaceful night ahead. The question many ask tonight is, why Chicago and why now?
Many of these teenagers are not vicious within themselves to the point of wanting to rise up against a whole city. Whenever they have difficulty, these groups constantly have their little wars among themselves. But it is not a normal procedure to expect young people to rise up against the whole city. It has to be some outside interference. Somebody who should not be doing it.
Well, I think you can't charge it directly to Martin Luther King, but surely some of the people that came in here and have been talking for the last year in violence and showing pictures and instructing people how to conduct violence, and they're on this staff, they're responsible in a great measure for the instructions that have been given, the training of the youngsters, and this has been called to the attention, I have repeatedly for the last year. The people who were in here training, actually training, and there's tapes on that, there's documentation, there's anything you want to show that certain elements that were in our city were in here for no other purpose but to bring disorder on the streets of Chicago. Someone has to train them. Who makes a Molotov cocktail? Do you think a youngster makes that? Someone has to train them. Someone has to show them.
Dr. Martin Luther King is in our Chicago studios. Dr. King, what about it? This charge that either you or your people are in some measure responsible for the violence that has broken out in Chicago the past 3 nights.
Well, this is absolutely untrue and unfounded. It is a known fact all over the nation and over the world that I have taught consistently a doctrine of nonviolence. I have done it here in Chicago And all of the members of my staff are absolutely committed to nonviolence, and I think it is totally unjust and even irresponsible to say that the individuals who are trying to bring about a peaceful resolution of a very serious problem are responsible for riots when they develop. We do not advocate riots. We think they are socially destructive and that they are self-defeating. And I think we'll have to put the blame for this riot where it really is. And that is the failure of America and the failure of the city of Chicago to deliver its promises to the Negro people. And this riot was born out of the wounds of frustration, despair, deep discontent, and seething desperation on the part of those who were misguidedly lashing out against a society that they feel did a grave injustice and continues to do a grave injustice to them.
Dr. King, Mayor Daley says that your people, in a sense, perhaps taught violence by displaying films of violence, films of Watts, for instance, to young people in Chicago.
There have been instances when we showed films of Watts, but we did it for a very positive reason. We were seeking to show that Watts accomplished nothing but the death of 34 Negroes and the destruction of property and the destruction of a community where the people themselves lived, where they needed to hold it together. In other words, these films were shown to demonstrate the impracticality of violence and the fact that nothing could be more unwise than to follow the course of Watts.
You are said just tonight to have reached an agreement with Mayor Daley in Chicago. Could you detail that agreement for us?
Well, this agreement is something that came about in an attempt to bring about some immediate relief. We realize that there are still long-term things that must be done, and we will continue with that program to grapple with the serious problems of housing, of jobs, of education, welfare, and the other areas. But we felt that there were some things that the mayor could do today or tomorrow so that we could go back and say to the people that something will change and this may ease tensions.
What are those things, Dr. King, that are going to change today or tomorrow?
Well, the mayor first agreed to provide water sprinklers, so to speak, that could be placed on fire hydrants in communities where excessive heat existed and where children were in dire need of some cool air and cool water, so that this would be done immediately. In those areas, people live in very crowded housing conditions, and it's something like this is needed. The second thing is that in the areas of the riding, there are few parks and recreational facilities and no swimming pools. So an agreement was made to build swimming pools immediately and recreational facilities in those areas, and to make it possible for Negroes to use parks in adjacent communities where they have been harassed and intimidated in the past. And the other thing is, the mayor agreed to appoint a committee of 100 citizens to review all police activities and make recommendations to him concerning ways and means to improve relationships between policemen and the citizens of the community, particularly the Negro community.
Dr. King, we had a report this afternoon from Washington correspondent Daniel Shore of CBS News, the fact that these Chicago riots were sparked, at least in part, perhaps in large measure, by an organized guerrilla action by armed Negro extremists.
Well, I don't know the details of those who may be behind the riots. I mean, I don't know the details of forces that may have sought to fan the flames and the riots. There may be groups that perpetuated it, ones that got started. It got started spontaneously. Now, after that, there may have been groups that wanted to see violence and encouraged it. It is no secret that in many of the ghettos of our country, we've read about this in magazines and other places, there are groups strongly advocating violence and underground groups seeking to carry it out. And I think it is true that this may exist to some degree, but I have no information on that, and I certainly couldn't say that that is the case.
Floyd McKissick, the National Director of Corps, told me this afternoon that more and more Negroes across the country are buying more and more guns, Dr. King.
Here again, this may be true. I know that there is a mood in some segments of the Negro community that is so impatient that violence is becoming a part of their response. I think this is very unfortunate because I think violence creates many more social problems than it solves. But I do think that it is necessary for our nation to work passionately and unrelentingly to get rid of the conditions of injustice, of economic deprivation, of depressing housing conditions, inadequate education, and all of these things which breed violence. For after all, the Negro is the victim of broken promises, of deferred dreams, and there's still a tragic gulf between promise and fulfillment.
Thank you very much, Dr. King, in our Chicago studios. Roger Wilkins, Director of the Community Relations Service of the Justice Department and a nephew of Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, was dispatched to Chicago early this evening to keep President Johnson and the Justice Department abreast of developments there in that city. For a progress report on what has transpired in Chicago while we have been on the air, CBS News correspondent Bill Plant.
Reports of scattered incidents are beginning to come in. They are officially classified as minor. Rock throwing, a group of children breaking a window, grabbing whatever they can hold and running with it, and some small crowds dispersed. And 3,000 National Guardsmen are patrolling. Josh Darza has that story.
The 1st National Guard troops took to the streets just before 8 p.m. this evening. This initial unit was the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Brigade of the Illinois National Guard. These troops were armed with rifles, bayonets, hand grenades, BARs, machine guns, and every type of device used to quell disturbances. The Commandant of the 3rd Brigade, Colonel Curtis Milan, a veteran of the fighting of Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, says the National Guard is prepared even for door-to-door combat. It promised to be a long night on the west side of Chicago.
The agreement reached between Mayor Richard Daley and Dr. Martin Luther King calls for the addition of sprinkler units to the fire hydrants in the city of Chicago, federal funds for pools, and a citizens committee to discuss police problems. These will undoubtedly help, officials say, to alleviate the situation here. But whatever the future is to be in race relations, the city has gone to great lengths to ward off just such happenings as have occurred the past 3 nights. And those who know such conditions say that unless the conditions are wiped out, it could happen again. This is Bill Plant, CBS News at the Northwest Armory, Chicago.
And so Chicago moves into another tense and difficult summer night. But not just Chicago. For the fact is that the traditional Negro leadership, the men of CORE and SCLC, of SNCC and the NAACP, these men confess they are not sure they can control the bitterness and the frustration rising now among Negroes in 40 cities of the North. Washington and Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Newark, Cleveland, St. Louis, Oakland, and Los Angeles. In all these cities, too, the fuse is lit. There is no intent here to cry danger where there is none. Rather, there is the need to tell America again what frustration, bitterness, and envy lie not very deep beneath the surface of this affluent society. This is Mike Wallace. Good night.
This has been a special report from CBS News.